February 1, 1943. In the pale dawn light over the Algerian desert, the airbase at Biskra stirred awake. A heavy bomber stood ready among its sisters, olive drab, massive, engines humming. This was the B-17F, nicknamed Freedom's Wing. Captain Ethan Reynolds and his crew gathered around her, checking gear, loading bombs, strapping in. The desert air was still and full of purpose. At sunrise, the mission would begin. Reynolds climbed into the pilot's seat, his co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Donovan, beside him. Behind them, the radio operator, the navigator, the gunners, each taking their station. On the ground, the crewman guided the bomber into position. Mechanical checks echoed against steel. Ethan looked ahead at the horizon. He felt the weight of steel under him and the lives of his men. He pushed the throttle forward. The engines roared awake. In the canvas briefing tent, Major Lucas Red Caldwell stood before the maps. He addressed the assembled crews. "Gentlemen," he said, "our aim today is the docks at Tunis and Bizerte, key supply ports for the Axis in North Africa. We'll climb to 20,000 feet, drop our bombs, then head home. Fighter cover will be limited. Expect enemy interceptors. Expect flak. Stay in formation. Hold your fire discipline. Trust your crew." The men nodded. They listened. They knew the risk. Engines thundered as Freedom's Wing taxied out. A low tracking shot across the left wing. Dust stirred. Propellers spun. The bomber lined up, flaps set, the heavy tires over the sandy runway. With a violent lurch, the plane lifted, climbing into the dawn sky. Ethan held the controls steady, the desert falling away, the mission underway now. The formation climbed above the North African coast. Below, the Mediterranean glinted. All around, 4-engine bombers moved in unison, steel birds in a sky of war. Crew heads pressed against plexiglass, eyes scanning. The wind whined past, the hum of propellers constant. Ethan glanced at his instruments. Marcus beside him adjusted the throttle. They held the line. Approaching the target near Tunis, the bomber formation entered a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Black puffs of smoke blossomed like deadly flowers around them. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky and rained around the bombers. "Flak zone ahead," crackled over the radio. The men tightened their harnesses, boots planted firm, hearts pounding in steel frames. The bomb bay doors opened. Below, the docks rose out of the shimmering Mediterranean Sea. Cargo ships docked and waiting, the enemy's supply lines exposed. In the bomb bay, the racks rattled, the heavy metal of the bombs shifting slightly as the bomber pitched. The doors slid open. The bombs dropped away into the abyss, disappearing toward the target. Outside, the B-17 swept past with wings steady, engines roaring. The moment of release passed, and now the turn for home began. But there would be no rest yet. High above the action, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 dove from the right. Its silhouette sharp against the sky, it dived toward the bomber formation like a hunting hawk. The waist gunner saw it and shouted over the intercom, "Bandit, 5 o'clock high." The bomber crews braced themselves. Red tracer rounds flashed. The anti-aircraft fire still erupted below. The sky had grown colder. At that second, in a heartbeat, disaster struck. The fighter's wing clipped the bomber's tail section. A giant gash ripped the fuselage. The rear section nearly severed. Inside the bomber, the shock wave trembled the cabin. Metals screamed, wires flailed. the tail hunched on only a few twisted supports. For that instant, it seemed impossible the giant plane could stay airborne. But it did. The crew held their breath. In the tail gunner's turret, Thomas Walker braced himself as the structure twisted beneath him. Behind, the void of sky, the missing stabilizer visible through the opening. In the cockpit, Captain Ethan Reynolds' face set in determination, but his eyes betrayed the tension. Lieutenant Marcus Donovan beside him watched the gauges flicker, warning lights blinking red. The control cables were severed, most of them. Only a few electrical servos remained. Ethan spoke in calm voice. "Hold her steady. We're going home." Over the vast desert below, the setting sun painted the sky in fiery hues, the dust kicked up by the bomber's tail dragging, still swirling behind. The bomber limped home, its tail section missing key stabilizers, a visible wound in the sky. Captain Ethan Reynolds gripped the controls, co-pilot Marcus Donovan monitoring the gauges, each instrument a reminder of the damage they'd survived. Every mile flown was earned, every minute a triumph of will. The other bombers stayed close, an escort of steel around a wounded comrade. They did not leave her. The escort formation moved as one, a silent promise of protection. Below them, the desert stretched endless, the wind-scoured dunes whispering of home and danger. Ethan exhaled slowly. The engines droned. The bomber held course. As the airfield at Biskra came into view, the approach began. Flaps extended, landing gear down, the tailwheel feared but determined. The runway ahead was sandy, low visibility from the evening haze. The bomber's shadow stretched behind. Ethan checked speed, altitude, tail drag risk. Dust kicked up in the landing path, the bomber's tail trailing a plume like an exhausted horse.
Touchdown. The main wheels hit the sandy surface, the tail scraped behind, a cloud of sand sprayed out. Ground crew rushed toward them. The bomber slowed, the engines wound down. The crew climbed down from the plane, unhurt, standing in the desert twilight. Relief washed across their faces. They had returned. Mechanics gathered under floodlights that night, the bomber on the ground, scaffolding around the tail section. They worked in silence, tools clinking, rivets being set. The aircraft would fly again, but tonight it rested. The men were tired, but proud. They had faced the worst. In the weeks ahead, the patched-up bomber, scarred yet steadfast, taxied and lifted off once more. The tail, though damaged, held firm. Freedom's wing climbed into the sky again, engines roaring, as if declaring, "We are not done." Captain Reynolds guided her upward. The crew behind him nodded. This machine and their mission continued. And so, this story became legend. The bomber that should not have stayed airborne, yet flew home. A testament to courage, machine, crew, and fate. The desert had tested them, the sky had battered them, yet they came home. As the dust settled and the engines cooled, the story of Freedom's wing did not end. Word of the bomber's return spread through the desert airfield like wildfire. Crews gathered, mechanics whispered, pilots nodded in respect. Captain Ethan Reynolds climbed from the aircraft, his boots sinking into the sandy ground. Co-pilot Lieutenant Marcus Donovan stood beside him, the faint glow of relief on his face. They had made the flight home. In the hangar, photographs circulated. Images of the bomber in flight, the tail section nearly severed, the sky visible beyond steel girders. Men pointed, shook their heads, and quietly thanked their stars. The great bomber had defied the odds.
Mechanics under floodlights that evening worked around the clock. They replaced spars, riveted new plates, patched torn metal. Sweat, oil, and sand clung to their uniforms. In the glow of the lights, the aircraft still looked wounded but alive. The mission would go on. A few weeks later, Freedom's wing taxied to the runway once again. The tail bore scars, but stood firm. Engines roared, the propellers spun, and the bomber lifted into the blue sky. Captain Reynolds guided her upward, and from the waist gun was the feeling of a machine reborn. The men behind him had trusted their lives to steel and skill, and both had held. Through missions over Europe, North Africa, the battered heavy bombers flew. The crews, in olive-drab flight suits and leather helmets, carried bombs, hope, fear, and determination. The image of the bomber returning with a shredded tail became legend, a symbol of resilience. In photographs and film grain, you see steel wings against flak-filled skies. You see gunners firing, navigators peering through maps, engines roaring above. You see men like Captain Reynolds, Marcus Donovan, Thomas Walker, and the crews who stood beside them. Their faces tell of courage, sacrifice, survival. An animated map traces their path. From Biskra in Algeria, across North Africa to Tunis docks, then back, the red line drawing a triangle across desert and sea. It was a mission. It was a test. It was a miracle. One flight, one crew, one bomber that should not have made it, but did. Back at the desert mess tent that evening, the men gathered. They spoke softly of what might have been, what could have gone wrong. Ethan raised a glass. Marcus nodded beside him. "To those who wait for us at home," Ethan said. They drank. They exhaled. For one night, the bombs were silent. The engines rested. The war paused. Slow motion now shows the battered bomber in flight, tail missing stabilizers, yet rising toward the sun. The words appear, "Miracle Flight, February 1, 1943. It became one of the most enduring images of the war. Steel, courage, survival in a sky of danger. Today, in a quiet museum hall, a B-17 sits on display. The tail section removed reveals the scars beneath. Visitors walk by, read the plaque, pause. They see the machine and imagine the men. The war is gone, but not forgotten. As the credits roll in vintage typewriter font, a distant engine hum fades into silence. Names of designers, crew members, photographers, researchers glide across the screen. A final salute to those who flew, those who served, those who survived. In the cockpit, every lever mattered. Every decision counted. Behind every metal panel, hope. From the waist gun position, machine gun barrels sweep the sky. Tracer fire arcs through the blue. The hum of the bomber around you, tension high but resolve higher. War in the air. The men stood ready.
Mechanics climb a ladder, flashlight beams scanning twisted metal. Sand blowing, the tail spars exposed, silent testimony to what almost ended it all. The bombers survived because the men refused to let failure win. A slow pan of desert dunes at dusk. Wind lifting sand, silhouette of a wing edge in the distance. Quiet, peaceful. The storm of war has passed for now. The sky holds memories. The desert tells the tale. Back in studio, your host stands. Thanks for joining this story of courage, steel, and survival. If you liked it, subscribe for more stories from the skies. The screen fades. The engine hum fades. The story remains. The story of Freedom's Wing, though rooted in a single mission,
echoes far beyond the desert runway. Crews at other air bases heard the tale and saw the photograph of the bomber with its tail nearly gone, yet flying. It became a symbol. Steel resilience, human resolve, a machine that refused to fail even when the odds said it would. In the warm glow of the hangar lights, engineers pored over the damage reports. They studied the torn spars, the missing stabilizer, the control cables frayed or gone. They asked themselves, how did it stay airborne? The answer lay in the training of the crew, the redundancy of the design, and the will of the men aboard. Each rivet, each bolt, every patch plate added told of survival. Back in the air, Freedom's wing flew again. The tail section still bore its scar, visible to all who looked. The crew returned to missions, their eyes unbowed, their machine scarred but trusted. The bomber rolled down runways, climbed into skies of war, carried bombs and hope alike. The phrase, "coming in on a wing and a prayer," was whispered among air crews. Though the real name of the bomber was different, the spirit was the same. Years later, veterans would stand before the machine in a museum hall. Visitors asked, "Is that really the bomber that flew home with his tail torn off?" The reply, "Yes." And they told the story. The crew names, the date, the mission, February 1st, 1943. From the airfield at Biskra, over the Mediterranean to Tunis and back. One flight, one miracle. Today we look at that image and we don't just see metal and wings. We see courage. We hear engines. We feel wind. We imagine a tail gunner clinging on, a pilot guiding despite shattered controls, a crew praying silently as the desert stretched below. We remember that flight not because it was unique in damage, but because it was unique in survival. So now, as the engines fade and the shadows lengthen, remember, in the sky, the rules are relentless, the risks real. But on that day, in 1943, a bomber made it home. Not by luck alone, but by the skill of its crew, the strength of its machine, and the will to live. And that is the story of Freedom's wing. The hearts of the crew remained linked to the bomber long after the engines cooled. In letters home and in memoirs, Captain Ethan Reynolds spoke not only of steel and flight, but of faith. Faith in his crew, faith in the machine, and faith that they would return. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Donovan, later wrote, "We did not expect to fly with a missing tail, but our training, our bond, and the aircraft itself held us." When the photo circulated, the image of the bomber flying home with its tail nearly torn away, the men felt a quiet pride. Mechanics who patched the wounded structure at Biskra spoke in hushed tones of that flight. Pilots at other bases referenced it. The bomber was no longer just a machine. It had become a symbol. In the dim light of the hangar, the scars lay bare. Twisted beam, missing stabilizer piece, the tailwheel assembly bent. Each dent, tear, and rivet told a story of survival. One engineer would point to the repair plate and say, "This is what saved her." The machine would fly again, but that night stood as proof. If crew and machine held together, miracles could take flight. Far beyond the desert of North Africa, the story spread, through aircrew mess halls, through veteran reunions, through quiet rooms where survivors spoke of that day. The mission was classified. The bomber was one of many. Yet the return with a wounded tail remained unmatched. The phrase, on a wing and a prayer, found new meaning among those who knew what it felt like to cling to hope in the sky. Today, the aircraft rests in museum hangars or sits as rusted relics, but the story lives on. Visitors pause before the photograph. They read the plaque. They see damage and think, how did she fly? The answer lies in men like Ethan, Marcus, Thomas Walker, and their comrades, who held steady in the face of terror. Engineers and aircrew who refused to abandon what should have failed. As the sun sets over deserted runways and the hum of distant engines fades into memory, we remember this flight not simply because of damage, but because of return. A bomber torn open in midair, yet returning. A crew intact, a mission complete. In that moment, the sky paid attention, the desert bore witness, and the bomber, wounded yet airborne, became legend. Let this story serve as a reminder. In war, as in peace, it is not the lack of damage that defines us, but how we respond when the wings begin to wobble, when the tail begins to give, when the odds say it should not end well. That day, it did. The bomber returned. The men lived. The story endured. And now, as the credits begin to roll, we close this chapter of Sky and Steel. But the echoes remain. The roar of engines, the snap of a spar, the voice in the turret, the prayer on the runway. Keep watching the skies, because when machines fail, we still fly home on hope.